I talked about Nowhere Else on Earth a little bit this morning, but I didn't actually talk about the story and the people of the story, and that's one thing I'd like to do a little bit. I'll repeat that. The story of the Lumbee Indian outlaw Henry Berry Lowry and his wife Rhoda was a story that I had wanted to write ever since I was a teenager, and a story that had stuck in my mind, but I knew would take some time for me to learn the history, learn how to write, and build up the courage to do it. I first heard it from someone who was a Lumbee Indian herself, and as soon as I got home from that trip, I began to look for information, and there wasn't any. There was just absolutely nothing to read. And as time went by, in the early 1960s, there were two history books published, one history of the Lowry outlaw gang, and another one that was basically the same thing, but contained more Indian lore and tradition. So those two books became my starting point. Then Jill McCorkle sent me the history of Robeson County, and covered white people, black people, and Indians, and that was a really valuable source for me. But those were my three main books that I used for sources, and everything else I had to scramble for. I looked for old newspaper clippings and found that the relevant issues of the local newspaper had all been burned up in a fire, so that was that. And I just began a slow process of digging around everywhere I went. Henry Lowry was a young man at the end of the Civil War. And during the Civil War, the Lumbee Indians had been not allowed to enlist in the Confederate Army. Although in South Carolina, their cousins were allowed to enlist. But in North Carolina, there was a great deal more antipathy towards the Lumbees. Where that comes from, I'm not sure, but white people, when questioned about the identity of the Lumbees, have always been very resentful that they say they claim to be Indians. And white people have always, most white people, especially the closer to Pembroke that they disputed that claim and said they are not real Indians, they are mulattoes. And the Indians have always claimed to be Indians. The Lumbees have always claimed to be Indians. I think the black community seemed split. I found records of black people saying those aren't real Indians. Charles Chestnut says those aren't real Indians. And yet, the outlaw Indian gang included at least 2 or 3 black people. And so there was a definite alliance between the Indians and the blacks. And the Lumbee Indians never lived as black people or white people or Indians. They were hated by the Cherokees, and the Cherokees have denied, until the last 5 years, have denied the Indianness of the Lumbees, or the legitimacy of the tribal identification. So at the end of during the Civil War, they were not allowed to enlist in the Confederate Army, but they were conscripted. They were seized as prisoners, and they were sent to Fort Fisher at Wilmington to work on the fortifications there, which were an earthworks fortification. So it was a digging job. Hundreds of them died in that work, and they were buried there in the dirt. The graves are not marked, and I went out there, and the park ranger said, "No, we know they're there, but we have no idea where any of them are or who they are." The names were not recorded. So that was one of the things that was an important factor in the rise of the outlaw gang. Henry Lowry and some of his cousins and many of his neighbors, as soon as the war was over, formed an outlaw gang that robbed local white plantations and killed a good many people. But I wanted to find out why that had happened, and I wanted to follow the story of the gang. He married his cousin Rhoda, and together they were acknowledged by everyone, white, black, and Indian in the county, as the handsomest and most beautiful man and woman that anyone had ever seen. At the same time that I saw newspaper accounts about that, I read this fascinating history book by Eric Hobsbawm called Bandits. And he studied 7 different bandit communities around the world, not including the Lumbeys, but he studied outlaw gangs in Afghanistan, Turkey, Brazil, Russia, and found an amazing pattern of similarity among these gangs. He did not include the Jesse James type gangs because those were out for money. His idea of the outlaw gangs he was studying were what he called social bandits, people who actually don't gain any advantage from their robberies, but are doing it for community reasons. And he says this is what happens in all of these communities, and it applied exactly to the Lumbee community. He said a people that has been isolated and deprived and discriminated against for a very long time is pushed to a new limit. And at the end of the Civil War, that was starvation. In eastern North Carolina, at the end of the Civil War, there was no food, and prices for food were sky high. In addition to that, the Lumbeys had cooperated with the Union to some degree and had been promised that at the end of the Civil War they would be rewarded by the Union. Those promises disappeared and were not kept. Third, Henry witnessed the lynching of his father and brother by the Home Guard. The Home Guard, as you may know if you read Coal Mountain, were the people left behind when the able-bodied men went off to war. The Home Guard were the older people or men somehow unsuited for the Army, and they were left in charge of the county. And there's no question but that Henry's father, Allen, and his brother, William, were shot to death by the Home Guard just a few days before the war ended. So those were the things that pushed him to a limit. And then, according to Hobsbawm, an outlaw gang is formed because they really don't have much choice. What else can they do to feed their people? And he said, a leader rises, and he is always the handsomest young man around. Looks are very important when you're choosing your outlaw leaders, evidently. And then a girl joins it in every one of these examples, from Brazil to Afghanistan, and it's usually the leader's girlfriend. So there's this gang of men out in the woods with a handsome leader, a pretty girl, and they succeed to some extent over a period of time in either feeding their people or gaining some kind of political rights for their people. And then in the end, every time the same thing happens and the man is killed. And then the same thing happens in the last final step, and that is he begins to be seen again after his death. That suddenly brought to mind to me not only Jesus, but also Elvis and other leaders. And Henry Lowry, to this day, is sometimes spotted by people in the community. And that many people had said, "Oh, my grandfather saw him come back." So the legend arises that he really didn't die. He escaped. He went somewhere. And I wanted to solve all these mysteries. But the story was the thing that just hypnotized me and drew me in and kept me for 10 years. I could have gotten 2.5 college degrees in that time, but I spent, my family got pretty tired of the Lumbeys and the Lowrys. But both of my kids wrote their senior history papers about Henry Berry Lowry. The teacher had never heard of him before. And I have to say again that it was just a delightful time for me. I've never enjoyed anything more, and I've never had anything be so rewarding as that book was. One of the high points for me was doing a book signing in Durham, and I was sitting at a table, and this really beautiful, tall, stately woman said, "Would you sign my book?" And I said, "Yes, thank you." And she said, "I want to thank you for writing it, because Rhoda was my great-grandmother." And I thought, holy cow. You know, it was just eerie and scary, and I was without words for a minute to see standing before me somebody who really was related, directly descended from the woman that I could, although I knew she was real, I couldn't help over that amount of time, starting to think of her as mine. And that's what Rhoda's my character, and how could she have a great-grandfather? But that did then happen many times, and I met many descendants. When I first met Louise, my really close Lumbee friend, at the Country Club Book Club in Durham, she said, "You're writing a book about..." No, she said, "What are you writing now?" I'd never met her before. And I said, "I'm writing a book about the Lumbee Indians." And she said, "Oh, I know about the Lumbees." And I said, "You do?" And she said, "I am a Lumbee." And I said, "Holy cow." She was the first one I'd ever met. And she said, "Is Henderson Oxidine going to be a character in your book?" And I said, "Yeah, he's my favorite character." And she said, "He was my great-grandfather." And Henderson was my favorite character. He was the last man hanged by the state of North Carolina for a murder he did not commit. And he sang at his own hanging. He sang Amazing Grace. And of course I found out that Louise's whole family was a singing family. She said her daddy sang, and her grandfather sang, and her great-grandfather sang. Beautiful voices, and her children are beautiful singers. So the book had a resonance for me in so many different ways.